It gives me two options.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the review session. If you haven't already, just if you could fill out the form in the chat. This is just so we could get attendance and see how many people showed up, as well as this will help us for funding for future events as well. So we're going to start out with just some open questions. So the floor is open for you guys. If you have questions, you can either unmute or say it in the chat. My name's Lauren. I'm one of the tutors, and I'm also joined with Yulong and Rowie. They're also tutors here at the Learning Commons, and we're going to be here to answer any questions. Would you be able to send those problems, Christian? We did not receive any, so if we could just kind of like take a look at those, if anyone's able to send the problems that the professor uploaded. Okay, perfect. Practice exam one. Let me take a look at that.
After this, can you also show us like last year midterm paper or something, so that we can get an idea how will the exam look?
Yeah, so I don't believe I have one offhand, but if anyone does, we can definitely go over it. I'm just taking a look at the practice exam right now in the chat that was just sent. So we're gonna go through that, and it looks like this is quite similar to like the way he usually structures exams. I can share my screen. Just give me a second just to take a look. So we'll take a look at this question over here, right? Write a complete main method that does the following. Takes two command line integers, arguments, both integers, and if there are not two arguments, it will throw an illegal argument exception with an appropriate message. Otherwise, we output to the console the sum and product of those numbers, each on a different line. So this is a way to make sure that we have the right inputs, right? So when we have legal argument exceptions, these are the error messages that you'll get in red. And what this will do is it will notify the person that, hey, this is a bad input. So what we can do for this case is we could have our main argument. Let me see, what would be a good way to type this up? So what we can do here is we could create a main method, right? So we can do you guys could see me typing, right? Or just want to be sure.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So we can do our public static void main method right here. And we're going to be taking in command line arguments here. So this is going to be both integers. So we're going to have int args. So it'll be an integer array of arguments. And within this, we're going to test to make sure that there are two arguments, right? So if the args dot length is not equal to 2, this is going to be our sign to create a illegal argument exception. So here is where we're going to throw a new illegal argument exception. It's going to abbreviate that with IAE. And inside of this is where we put our message. So we can tell the user, please provide two arguments. You can put any message that you want inside of these. Usually they'll give you a message, but this just says write an appropriate message. So this is totally fine to put whichever message that you seem fit. So once we have this done, right, we know that if it passes this, it actually does have two arguments. So now we can move on to the next part that are saying, otherwise, output to the console the sum and product of those numbers, each on a different line. So actually, if we're doing command line arguments, I believe this would have to be, instead of an int, this would have to be a string, I believe. So when we do command line arguments, we're going to have a string array. And what this will allow us to do is it will allow us to take these arguments that the user puts in, right, as strings.
Sorry,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt you, but can you use a darker color or a clear page? I can read it correctly.
Yeah, let me actually,
Sorry for interrupting you.
no, you're good. You're good. I can retype that. Is this a little bit better?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, not a problem. Okay, so let me just redo that. So we have our public static void main string args. So this time, instead of doing an int, we're going to take them in as strings because they're command line arguments. That means that it's being taken input by what the user is going to input. And the user is going to type it in as a string, right? Just as normal characters. And we're going to have the same part where we're going to have, say, if args length is not equal to 2, then we're going to throw new illegal argument exception. And then the message, provide two arguments. Okay. So this is going to be the first part of it, right? Where we have our illegal argument exception if it's not equal to 2. Now, otherwise, we can output to the console the sum and product of those numbers. The issue here is that we took them in as strings. So we need to now put them into integers. And we can do that by using the parse int function. So what we can do here is we can create a try catch statement. What this will let us do is if the input that the user put in was something that can be converted to an integer, then it can easily be parsed into an integer. But if the user decided to not give us a valid value, then we would have to say that there was an error there. This error would be thrown to the user, similar to how we did our illegal argument exception. So this is one way that in this class we learned how to throw and catch errors so that it's not just an if statement saying like, oh, hey, if there's an error, just ask the user for a new input. Like, no, we're actually going to throw an error to the error screen that pops up as that red text and doesn't let the user proceed until that error is fixed. So that's what we're doing when we're doing a try catch statement. So let's do try. This is what we're going to try. We're going to try to parse it. If we can, great. If it doesn't work, then we're going to have a backup. So I'm going to create two integer variables. I'm going to say int num1, right, for the first number. And this is just going to be integer dot parse int args at position 0. So what this is saying is create an integer, and inside of it, I'm going to parse the string that I was given into an integer. This is done with a wrapper class, integer dot. This says that I can take whatever this input is, which in this case is going to be our string here, arg0, because that was taken from the main input. And I'm going to parse it into an int and store it into our num1. I'm going to do the exact same with num2. Now, assuming that this works and we don't get an error, we can now output the sum and product to the console. So whenever we do a try, we're going to try something that we're not sure is going to work. But for this part, we're going to assume that it works. If it doesn't work, that's when we're going to get into the catch statement on the bottom. So let's just create the sum. We can just create a normal sum variable. And this is just something that you've probably done in like 111 and 211. Just take the sum of num1 and num2. Since these are both now, hopefully, integers, if it worked correctly. That means this part will also work correctly. We can do the same for the product. I'll move this up in a second. So over here, we just have our normal try statement that we're going to try. We converted our integers here, our strings to integers, and we just created our sum and product variables. Now, it's just a simple output statement to the console, right? We can just do a simple system output. Let me just try to move this over just a little bit, make it a little bit easier to see. So now what I can do is I can do system.out print then our sum and just sum and then system.out print product. Okay. So what this will do is it'll do our sum, it'll do our product, given that we don't experience an error. Now, if we do experience an error, this is where we would need to take into account what we will do with that error. This we can do using what's called a catch statement. So I'll do the catch statement in a dark blue. That's the one. Okay. So now our catch statement is going to say, if that try statement has an error at all to it, immediately catch that error, meaning do everything that's inside of this catch block. So first we need to say what type of error we're expecting. So if we had a string and we found that we couldn't convert that into an integer, that means we have what's called a number format exception. The number that we tried to convert is not within the same it's not within the same format that we want. It's not something that can be converted to an integer. Okay, and we can just call that number format exception. Let's just say let's say I for integer. You can call it anything you want. This is just saying it's an exception by this name. Okay. And within this block over here, what we'll do is we'll tell the user by throwing our exception that, hey, your arguments are not valid. So just like how we did in the beginning, where we said if the arg's length is not equal to 2, it's not equal to the right number, we threw a new illegal argument exception and said provide 2 arguments, right? We're going to do the exact same thing over here. We're going to say throw new illegal argument exception, just like what we did before. And this time we can say arguments are not integers. So now this would print to the error screen in that red text that, hey, your arguments were not integers. They couldn't be converted. We tried doing this red block of text here, but as soon as I had an error that popped up, instead of just saying that there's an error, now we have the illegal argument exception telling the user exactly what the error is. That makes it a little bit more personalized for how we handle these errors happening. Since you're probably very familiar with just the red text popping up saying, oh, you have an error in line, whatever. This will actually tell the user, hey, you have an error that is this type, a number format exception, and it's saying that the arguments are not integers. So whenever we have that, now whenever we load in our arguments, we can now see that there's a try and a catch statement that have both possibilities. Either it works, the user successfully gave us good arguments that were integer, that could be parsed into integers, or a bad argument that was given in that we just catch that error and we tell the user, hey, your arguments are not good. So this would be what we can do for that code. Okay, so let me see questions in the chat. Why throw can't print do the same? Great question. So print and throw are very similar in that it's telling the user that there's an issue. But when we throw an error, what this is saying is it's going to stop the program from running because, hey, there's an error. We can't go further. But instead of just printing to the user's console like there's an error here, it's going to stop the program, tell the user what the issue is, right? In this case, was it that we had an illegal argument exception that the argument length wasn't good, or that the arguments were not integers? It's going to tell the user that. And in this program, we didn't have anything go further. But what I can do is I can stop the program and resume the program. Instead of just throwing an illegal argument exception, I can do this and continue the program at the end over here. And I could have something that says, okay, let's give the user another chance to enter something else. But what this lets me do is it lets me handle exactly what the error is. I can try something And if it works, great. If I think there could be an error somewhere, I can say the exact error that happens here and exactly what to do in that case. So yes, you could use a print statement, but when you're dealing with data types that could provide errors or something that could easily provide some like an error to it, and you want to be able to stop the program at any point and tell the user, hey, there's an issue here, and say exactly what needs to happen after that error, it's best to throw an illegal argument exception in order to really have that personalized effect to it, and to really make sure that exactly what you want happens and you get the exact inputs that you want. So you don't need to know all the exceptions, but some of them are good to know. For instance, a legal argument exception, right? Like, what is an argument? An argument is just what we pass up here, right? These are called command line arguments because they're passed into our main function here as a string, right? This is what the user is putting in. I can say something like I pass in a string like hello. Now, this would be a bad input because, again, number one, it's not length of 2, so it wouldn't even make it past this point. But if, let's say, I put in 2 arguments, like hello, and let's say the number 12, now it also wouldn't get to this point either, because it would get stopped right here. I try to parse my first argument, this, and I realize, oh no, I have a number format exception. This is not in a numerical format. This one, on the other hand, would have worked correctly because I could have easily parsed the string 12 into the number 12. But since they both don't work, since one of them doesn't work, I'm not able to do the sum and the product. So we would end up having our number and format exception at the end. Questions? So the first error is saying you didn't provide 2 arguments, and the second is if you provided 2 arguments, but they were not integers. Exactly. So this one, the first one, is for this part, number 2, if there are not 2 arguments. The second one here, this catch statement, is saying if you can't find the sum and product, if I'm not able to parse it, if they're not valid numbers. As for the other arguments that other exceptions that you should probably know, let me take a look. Question, can I just write throw new illegal argument exception, or do I have to type the... Oh yeah, so you actually do have to type the whole thing out. It would just end up being like really long if I typed the whole thing out, but what this would just be is I would type in throw new illegal argument exception. So this would be what we would want to have wherever we have IAE, legal argument exception. And this is going to work for any type of exception that we have, right? A number format exception. If there's an array that's out of bounds, that's often a very popular one too, right? Like a legal bound argument usually is one. If let's say you say that there's an array of capacity, I don't know, 10, and you call something that is in a range 11, right? There is no 11 inside of this bound of 10. So because of that, you would get a error for your array being out of bounds. You probably have gotten these errors yourself. Like if you're doing if you're coding up a problem and maybe you have a loop and the loop doesn't end at the right point, so it's telling the program to output a value that doesn't exist, right? All of these are things that you can essentially handle. And why a string argument and not an int? So when we do command line arguments, we take it in as a string. Think about when you do something like in C++, if you remember doing cin, right? This takes in the user's input as a string, right? So I can set this equal to an integer, yes, but whenever you're taking input in, you're taking it as a string because you're able to take in a variety of characters. You can do normal alphabetical characters, like if you were to just say hello, or if you had something like the number 12. Well, yes, this is a number from our perspective. The user's entering it in their keyboard. So it's a string until I parse it into an integer. And parse is just another way of saying convert this from a string to an integer. And since this was in a string format, right, we just want to convert this to an integer. That way we can do mathematical operations with this. Because the string 12 is just the ASCII values of 1 and 2. It's just characters. You can't do math with characters. If you were to do math with characters, you'd end up with something like adding the characters together. And like if you remember from I think 211 where you had to capitalize letters by adding, I think it was 64 or something like that to the ASCII value, right? It's changing one ASCII value from another. We don't want to do that when we're adding integers together. We want to actually find the numerical value of this. So that's why we want to convert this from a string, make sure it's an integer. And also this lets us say like, hey, if the user decided not to read the instructions and said like hello or something that didn't have uh just numbers in it. I mean, even if they did something like 12H, right? This is a string. This is something that the user could have entered. This is not valid because what is H? H is not a number. While you can convert the 1 and the 2 from the ASCII character to the actual integer, you can't really do that with H. So that's why we want to make sure we do that first. Okay, question. In these exams, do you get partial credit for correct logic with some method name errors or things like that? Yeah, so you can definitely get partial credit. If you like don't have the right name or maybe something is off, like maybe you forgot number format exception and you said like number form exception. Um, Usually you can get partial credit with that. The lab professors are usually the ones that are grading these exams. So because of that, usually if there's like an issue, you can kind of talk to them about it. They're pretty lenient, I'd say. I wouldn't just say, rely on just that, but you can absolutely get partial credit. The logic is really what's the most important thing. If you have logic and if the syntax isn't exactly correct, um, you're still on the right track because we all make mistakes. Maybe we miss a bracket or something. Actually, I think there is a missed bracket over here. There's a bracket here for try, and the end bracket is over here. So you see, look, we all make mistakes. So honestly, if you have a missing bracket, it's not a big deal. You can absolutely get partial credit for it. So definitely try your best when it comes to these problems. Okay, any other questions about this one? The key here is you take in your string arguments, check to see is it the right length? If not, throw in a legal argument exception. These arguments are not good. Next, you try to do something. If it works, then whatever happens in this box, in this brackets will work. If it doesn't, we have a catch as a backup statement. It's like having a net at the bottom of your code that says, hey, in case there's an error, I have a way to catch this error. I have a way to handle this error. So it doesn't just stop my program. It's not like my program just gives up midway. Like, no, it'll actually pause the program and then do something based on that. So you can do other things besides throwing an illegal argument exception too. But that's just what we're doing here. So okay, so we're going to take a look at the next question then. So question 2 is write the missing method below that will return the sum of a given row in the array. Right? This one right here. So if we take a look, right, we have our string arguments again here, and we're taking in over here an array. This is a array that has this is going to be a 2D array, right? We have our rows and our columns here. So we have 1, 2, 3 rows, right? That's what these main parts over here are. Okay. And then we have a variety of different columns. So we have 2 columns on this one, 4 columns on this one, 2 columns on this one. So over here we have system.out.println, get the sum of the row, array, row 1. So this is going to take in 10 and 45 into this function. And this method that we're going to create was put over here, and we just have to fill in the blanks over here. So let's see, we're taking in our array, ends the row. Okay, cool. So let's see, do we have to do any error correcting? Doesn't seem to be. Okay. So let's take a look at this now. So we have our title line there, and we're going to take in the array and the row of the array that we're dealing with, right? So let's start out by creating int sum equals 0. So this is just going to be our sum variable, and this will be what will increase each time to hold the sum of that current row. Okay. So we also know that we have the row is given as an integer argument over here. So if we're going to be dealing with a value in this array, right, we know that it's going to be my array. I'm just going to say my a for the time being. And this is going to be in position row, because the first part always deals with the first part of our array, the first set of brackets is always going to be the row. And then we're going to have the column be represented by an incremental variable, because we're going to increment each time to another part of the column. So that means we're going to go from column 0 and then column 1 for this first one here. So we know that the row is already given to us right here, and we're just going to have to increment each time with our C variable. And this we can do using a for loop. So I'm going to create a for loop, and we can start out with int C is equal to 0, right? Because C is going to be our first column, and we're always going to start out at 0 because that's always going to be our initial one. We're going to say when C is less than, let's see, we're going to do C is less than, we can use the length function here to kind of say, okay, give me the length of the row in this case. That way I'm incrementing each time. So when C is less than my array, row dot length. And C plus. Okay. So let's break this down. My array at position row is saying this part over here, right? This 10 comma 45, this tuple. Because the row itself is going to be the entire thing, that entire 10 and 45, or that entire 2, 42, 67, and 5, or the entire 3, 21. So if we're asking to find the length of that, we can say, okay, how many things are inside of that? Well, there's 2 in the first one. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 in the second. There's 2 in the third. If they were all the same, we could easily just put in a number there. We could say C is less than, let's say, 4 or something like that. But since it seems to be variable, and we want to also make sure it can work for any array that we put in, we're going to just include the length function here to say, okay, take the array row and find the length. So in case they decide to put in some row with like a length of 20 or something, we can adjust it each time. So we don't have to just say, okay, well, we need a function for if it's 2, if it's 3, if it's 4. No, this makes it a little bit easier for that. So we have our for loop over here, right? And I'm going to just that here. Should still be able to see that. Okay, perfect. So now what are we going to do inside of this for loop? Well, this is where we're going to add up each value, right? We're going to take our sum and we're going to set that equal to whatever is inside of our sum plus whatever is in our array at the index C. And I can say that by saying my array at position row at position C. Right, since this is a 2D array, we want to make sure that we're taking into account that, okay, I have the row that's given, and I have the C, my column that's given. So this is going to say, okay, I'm given my row that's taken from the function, and increment for each C throughout my array. And that's going to be stored within the sum. Now we can also do this in a shorthand version too. You probably have seen this before, sum plus equals my array, position row, position C. So either way it works, right? Either way, it's saying take the sum and set it equal to that same variable sum plus a value. Either way works. It's totally fine either way. I'm just going to keep it as the first one for the time being, just because I think it's a little bit easier to follow, but either way will totally work. Right? And that would be the end of our for loop, right? Because at this point, all right, I've looped through every single column that was inside that given row. I should be all good. So now I am good to actually end my function and decide what I'm going to return. Well, what am I going to return? Well, I'm returning the sum of a given row in the array. So all I need to just say is return our sum. And we know that this would work as well because what is our return type here? Int. And what is our sum? Int. So because of that, we know that we won't get any errors. It's not like we're trying to return a string in an int or like a double in a void. we want to make sure that our return type is always the same as the one that's given in the method definition. Right? So this is what we'll do here, and this would get us the sum of the given row, right? And in our main function, if we were to, okay, well, it's not asking us to do that, but if they were to say like, hey, give a main call, like a sample main call, we could also totally do that. We can say to call the function in our main. Let's just say we were going to do that. I can say over here, I can call that by saying, let me print out the value, system dot print ln. And what am I going to print out? Well, I want to call get sum of row and pass in my array. Oh, actually, it says it right over here. Okay. Yeah. So I can say my array. And let's just say I wanted to get a certain row. This one says 1, right? Let's say I wanted to print out 2. I could just put that in as my second parameter, and boom. So this would go over here along with the given sample output that they also had here, right? So this part over here, they also had system.println, get sum of row, array, and comma 1. So I can do either one. The array is actually named just ARR, so let me make sure that's accurate there. So I took that from the given one right here. But if there was another array, I could just put that here, right? This is the name of the array. And this is going to be my row that I'm going to give. So I can do anything that I want here. Okay, so that would handle that. Okay, let's take a look if we have any questions. Thank you so much, Yulong, for answering the questions in the chat. Just to confirm, so someone asked what's the out of bounds exception called? Index out of bounds exception. Yeah, I think that's right as well. So what that's saying is, remember the example I gave with the arrays? If let's say you accidentally called something and it didn't exist, that would be an index out of bounds. If you're saying, give me the 11th position in an array that only has like 10 positions, boom, index out of bound. And yes, in this case, you also have to put the empty parentheses after that, after length, because what dot length is a function. And in any function, you have to give parameters, right? Even though technically there's no parameters here, the parameter is what comes before it, right? This is the object, eraser the object, and this is the method that you're doing on this object. So if that ever happens, you just want to make sure you leave that empty. But anytime you have a function, even if you're not using parameters in that regard, you want to make sure you have that. Okay, good question. Is my array just ARR? So this goes over the difference between our main method and the variables that get passed into our functions. So I made a mistake earlier where I had ARR as my array. When we're dealing in the scope of the main method, meaning the brackets over here that are within this main method, we're only going to be using whatever variables are defined here. In this case, that's going to be the array, int ARR to open brackets. I can define anything I want here. I could have said something as well as int my array or int cool array, int whatever array, you know? And what that means is whatever I have here gets passed in as an argument over here. So if I just called it, let's say int a, just plain a on its own, and then I set it equal to whatever I wanted. So just pretend there's like some variable, there's some values here. whenever I'm calling the get sum of row, right? Just like what I did here, instead of saying ARR, I would just put the name of the array there. So this would be capital A. On the other hand, when we had inside of the function, right, we see that this was passed in as int bracket bracket my array. When we're inside of the scope of the function, whatever was passed through has now a reference pointer to my array. So anytime I'm inside of this function, I have my array, and this is going to give me what was passed in, which is just array. So it's a difference between the main scope and the inside scope. Java arrays have length as an instance variable, not as method, so it's actually dot length without parentheses. Okay, so that makes a little bit, that makes sense. So I think I was mixing that up with C++. So actually there are no parentheses in this case. Sorry about causing the error to someone. So I believe it's in C++ where you need to do dot length with the parentheses, but since we have an instance variable, what is an instance? An instance is saying that you have an object, right? An object is an instance of a class. It's as if you're saying, okay, I have the class animal, and now my object is cat from that. So because of that, I'm saying I'm taking my object and I'm doing dot length. So this lets me access it through this dot notation. So we don't need the parentheses for that. Well, yes, it's a function. If we're accessing it via dot notation, then we wouldn't need that. So I was just confusing that a little bit. So in C++, then yes, you would have length with the open brackets. But when we're doing Java, we don't have that. So just some syntax. Thank you for catching that. Okay, question. So compare this to C++. Java doesn't require you to declare the column because Java stores the rows dynamically and you can just access it via length. Yeah, so I'm not sure if you could do that in C++ as well, but what this is saying, right, when I say my array at row.length, okay, that's saying take my array at row. So let's just say I take this row, the first row, as an example. What's the length of this? There's two numbers in there. So it takes the length of what's inside of this row, aka what's inside of this tuple, what's inside of these curly braces. In this case, if we took the second row, right, it sees that there's 1, 2, 3, 4 in here. So that becomes a length of 4. So that's how we're able to say my array at position row. So that's just saying, okay, whatever row, whatever int, this is just an int number. And I put that in, right? I could say row 2, or I could say row 1. Whatever I decide, I could just put that in. And this would just say, okay, my array at whatever that integer row is, and find the length of that. So I don't know if it is because of its dynamically and how if it would affect it as well in C++. But as far as I know, you can just do this because you're given the row as an integer. And this is just saying my array at, let's just say 2. And then the other box would be filled in by a C. So since it's a 2D array, you have your row that's given, and then your C, which increments based on your for loop. So I hope that clears it up a little bit. So is that the same as saying my array at row column, but using length for that column? What do you mean by that? Like, are you saying that, like, if I said length as the column, okay, well, actually, if I were to say row and then put the dot length function here, this is going to give me the last value over here, right? So this is going to give me the, actually, we probably would have to do length minus 1 in this case. So let's say if you wanted to get the last value in an array. If I wanted to get, let's just say this 21 over here, or this 5, or something along those lines. I could be given my row over here, and I could have dot length minus 1. So remember, dot length is going to give me the entire length of this, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2. And we know that we have 0 indexing, so this becomes 0 and 1. Notice that there's no value of 2. So yes, there's a length of 2, but there's no value of 2. So if I were to get the last value, I would just have to subtract by 1. Yeah, so the row is set to 1. The column keeps getting incremented. Exactly. So in this case, our row is just set. It's whatever this integer is. It could be 1, 2, 3, whatever it is. But the C is our column. And this is going to be a variable. It's going to go from C0 until it's no longer less than whatever the length of my row is. So that's what this is saying, right? The length of my row. So this row here has a length of 2. There's 2 columns here. This row has a length of 4. There's 4 columns here. That's what we're finding here. Okay, in Java for 2D arrays, if we used myArray.length, will it be 3 since we have 3 rows? Yes, so exactly. That's a great point to bring up. So when we say myArray.length and we don't give a row value, what this is saying is it's going to break down how many rows do I have? Or how many groups do I have? I have 1 group, 2 group, 3 group. It doesn't give us how many values there are total. It's just going to tell us the number of rows or the number of like boxes that hold values in it. That's why if we wanted to find the sum of a row, the sum of the values inside of the row, we have to go inside of that row and then loop through each C value there is. You don't have to write the system out since it's already on the paper, right? This part, yeah, this part you don't have to write. I was just writing this as an example of what a main call could look like. The blue is the only things you have to write. So this blue is what's inside of the function. Sometimes he might ask you to do a sample main call, and all that's just saying is just give a sample of how you can call a function. And that's just like this one that was given or this one that we created here in the red. So yeah, either's totally fine, but the blue's all you need to know. Okay. Any other questions here? So if not, we're going to take a look at this one now, right? Question 3. Okay, cool. So we're going to write a Java program that will read a string using a J option pane, counts the number of characters that are digits, and display that number in another J option pane. This may make use of the method in the character wrapper class called isDigit. Awesome. So let's go over what this question's asking for before we actually code it out. So write a Java program that will read a string using a J option pane. So you've used J option panes before, right? Those are those like pop-ups that you have. So it'll kind of like pop up something like this. It'll tell you, hey, write something here, and then it'll give you a little text box for that, right? So it's going to read in our string, and it's going to loop through the number of the characters, and it's going to check to see, hey, is this a digit or not? Or is it not a digit? If it's a digit, we're going to display that number in another J option pane. Otherwise, it just won't do anything and it'll just go to the next line for that, right? So we're also able to make use of a method in the character wrapper class called isDigit. So we went through a little bit on what a wrapper class is when we did the first question when we were dealing with parse int, right? This is just saying that I can take a character, let's just say the character is like C, and I can say dot is digit. So I'm using the dot notation in this case, right? And oh, actually, wait, I'm sorry. If I'm using the wrapper class here, this would have to be character. So whenever we deal with the wrapper class, this dot part over here is going to have what we're so-called wrapping it into, the data type that we're dealing with. So we're dealing with a character, right? So we're going to have character dot is digit, and then we're going to plug in the actual character itself as the parameter inside this function. So once again, character, this is going to be the type that we're dealing with, right? Because we're taking in characters. We're checking, is it a digit? So this is going to give us a true or false value. True, is it a character? Is it a digit? Or false, it's not a digit. And we're going to test that on our C character over here. So this is what this function isDigit does. And we're going to use that to just test, hey, is this a character or is this not a character? Okay, cool. So with that being said, let's get this started over here. Right, let's change it up a little bit. I'll do dark green. So before we start out, we just have to import the actual J option pane. Since what this is going to, it's going to actually need this, and this is like an external library that we have to deal with. So I just kind of am thinking of like the actual code itself because I know that I've definitely tried to do these kinds of problems and then forgot to import this. And because of that, it would have caused a bit of an issue because, you know, it's not there. So you actually do need to make sure you import this first. So this is just the library that you're going to use it from. So that's just the import statement at the beginning. And then I don't know if he's requiring that or not, but it's always good to have that. So now we're just going to deal with our um, public class itself, right? Actually, are we dealing with the class here or are we not? Yeah. Okay, so anyway, this is the class, right? This is just the name of our program. And we'll have our main function over here. So this is just our standard public static void main. And just like last time, right, we're going to have our command line arguments, aka just some string arguments that the user is going to be inputting. So the user will input these guys, and just like last time, we'll be able to do something with them. So let's take a look at them now. We want to actually ask the user to input something, right? Just input a string, and that way we can use that string. So I can call that string input, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a J option pane, and I'm going to call from that library show input dialog. So this is going to make a pop-up that actually has this little input box. So this input box is going to tell, so first it's going to prompt the user, enter a string. And then from that, right, we're going to have the user input the string, right? And that gets saved as the string input. So now we can do something with that. We could actually test, hey, is this good or is this bad? So let me make this part that dark blue. Okay. So what we'll have is we'll have a test. We first want to see like, hey, is there anything in this function to begin with? Because if there's not, then like we know that it's gonna start off with just if we can't do anything if the string is gonna be empty. So let's just test if input is not equal to null, meaning that there would be an input there. We're going to create a variable that's an integer called digit count, right? We could just say digits. It's going to count the number of digits that we have, and we'll initialize that with 0. Since we're just going to start out with 0, and we're going to add a digit each time that we find that there's a digit within the input. So how do we loop through the entire input? With a for loop. So we can think of an input string as just like an array of characters. We could just use an input, we could use a for loop on the input to go through exactly what we want to, like, go through each character and see, hey, is this a digit? Is this not a digit? And then do something with that. So we're going to have for int I is equal to 0, right? Start out at the beginning. And I is less than, all right, how far are we going? Well, we're going to the end of the input. And once again, we can use our input.length function for that. We can use our .length function for this. So we'll do input.length. I will not include the parentheses this time, so we don't have an error happening. And then we're going to have I plus plus. Yeah, let me just check the chat real quick. I just see there's a lot of stuff coming in. Yeah, so the import, this is just like include. So you know how you have hashtag include, like IOStream from C++, that import Java X swing, that's just literally saying import this library, just like include this library. So this is not done in the main. The main is starting off with the public static void main. Import is needed for J option pane since it's an external library. What else would it be needed for? I know that you probably have done that text input file, I believe, which was like an external file that you used, and that lets you actually take in text. So if you're using something like that, you'd have to import that as well. I'm not sure if this would be assumed or not, honestly. I would just do it just to be on the safe side, since this is something that you would need, and it's saying write a Java program. So it's not just saying write a function. Like the question before this actually said, hey, write the missing method. So it was just the method, just the function. This is saying the entire program. So I would just try to make it as correct as you possibly can. But again, like you're not going to lose a ton of points, if any, honestly. I would think that the grader would be very lenient as long as the logic is correct. There is a missing parenthesis for the if statement. Oh no, you're right. Boop. All right, awesome. Yeah, it's like whenever I'm not like coding this onto like an actual IDE, so it's like not popping up as errors. But this is like a good way to practice too. Like you want to make sure you can catch errors like beforehand. Since like, you're writing the code, you're not going to be typing the code on the exam. So you're not going to have that luxury of seeing like, oh, there's an error here. Oh, does it compile? Oh, does it run? Um, don't worry, this is not how the real world works. You'll have your IDE kind of being a backup for you, but this is just really to test like, do you know how to do this without that IDE that's kind of like showing you like, hey, you're missing something here. Hey, you need to make sure you have a parenthesis here. So, are we using a public class digit counter because there is a J option pane? Yeah, so I'm doing the entire program here. Just because it said write a Java program, I'm doing the whole thing from the class itself. You can call it anything, honestly, the class. I just said digit counter because it's just counting the digits, but you can really call it anything. Same with variables. As long as they don't specify what the class, what the variables, what anything is called, you can be as creative as you want. So yeah, I'm just honestly writing this whole program out. So I have the import statement, I have the class statement, I have the void, the public main, for the main class. Um, Also, in case you wanted to put in a separate function, um, like it would like if you wanted to put in like a separate function, you'd put that in separately too. Like I could actually have, if I had to code the isDigit function myself, you would need to make sure you have a class. So, I mean, since this is just the main function, we don't, well, it's kind of hard to say because I don't really like I don't have like the answer key here, so like I don't know exactly how he wants it formatted. So I would honestly just be cautious in that way and just if worse comes to worse, just take extra caution. It's better to have more than less. And if you were to write an entire Java program, you would want to have your import and your class and your main. So that's just the way I'm doing that. Especially if I wanted to have like a separate function here. If they wanted me to code that isDigit function, I would do that within this class. Um, so yeah, I would just make a method just similar to how we did with question two. So that's kind of like why we're doing the class there. So yeah, you can call it any class you want, honestly. It's totally fine. And we're just doing public by default. We don't have to worry about like this in any other programs. If you were to do this like in an actual program and you don't want everyone to have access to it, then you would not use public. You'd use private or you'd use protected, right? But that's not really relevant to this one. On the solution page for this question, they're summing the digits for some reason. Oh yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. So yeah, let's go to that. All right, so we have our for loop here. And let's see. So what we can do here, right, is we want to loop through the entire, let's say, array of characters, because that's all a string is. It's just an array of characters. And if we're going to deal with that, right, we're going to have, we're going to treat each character as its own, like its own character to test. So what I can do is I can say, okay, let's have an if statement and test this value. I'm going to call character, the character class, right? Dot is digit. Okay. Now I have to put something inside here. So if character is digit, well, what character am I testing? I'm going to test the character that's at our current index. So I can say input, that's the name of my string, dot, I can call the char at function to tell me the character that's at my current index, position I. So this actually is this is quite actually a lot. So what we can actually do is we can say our character, this character that we're at right now, we can call that a separate variable if we want, so that the line isn't like super long. So if I wanted to, like in the example I wrote here, I just said character C. I can call this its own variable as well. So maybe we'll just do that just so it's a little bit easier to see. Right, I'm just going to call that character C, and I can just say not int, we're dealing with character. Not autopilot from the last question. Okay, character C is equal to, oops. It's the problem itself, not that. If character C is equal to, right, we're going to say, once again, we're going to use the char at function. Input dot char at position I. So I'm saying take my input, right? I'm taking my input string and I'm saying, hey, give me the character at this position, I. And I'm going to set that into C. So if let's say our input was like hello, right? Our character at int I equals 0 would be H, right? Since that's the first character. So char at position 0 would be H, and that gets set to be character C. So that means now I can say, hey, if character is digit at position C, so that's saying if my I'm sorry, if let's say the H that we put into char C, test is H a digit. Now what we're going to do is we're going to say if it is a digit, what are we doing here? Count the number of characters that are digits. So what I can do here is I can just say, right, we had our digit counter right here, int digits is equal to 0. I can just add 1 to that. If my character is a digit, I'm just going to say digits plus plus. Right? That's just the same as saying digits is equal to digits plus 1. So now, I mean, H is not a digit, but let's just say my input was something like 1, 2, 3. I would say the first character in index 0 is 1. And I know that that character is a digit, so my digit counter goes from 0 to 1. And it's going to loop through this until the end of our length, the end of the length of our string input, right? And that would get us our digit counter. Okay, let's see, we have the curly brace for the if statement and the curly brace for the for loop. Just move that down a little bit. Okay, cool. So once we finish this loop, we can assume that We made it through the entire length of our input string. So each time we went through it, we said, hey, is the character at this position a digit? If so, add 1. If not, just go to the next part of our loop, I++, and keep going each time testing, hey, is this character a digit? Once we reach the end of the length, this for loop is going to end. At the end of this, we have an accurate digit counter, and this will tell us how many digits were in our input. So what are we supposed to do with this? Well, the problem tells us display that number in another J option pane. Okay, cool. So remember how in the beginning I said our string input was equal to J option pane show input dialog right over here. Oh no, what the heck happened there? Shoot, it just deleted, I think. Okay, let me retype that then really quick. So we have our string, we have if input is not equal to null, int digits is equal to 0, initialize that. Then we have our for loop for int I equals 0, I is less than input dot length, I++, and we're going to test, right? Let's just set our character C equal to the input dot char at function, right? We're going to test if the character at that position is we're testing. We're seeing what that character is and setting it equal to just some variable C. Now we can see, hey, is the character a digit? If it is, we'll do digits plus plus. And in case something like that happens again, it deletes. Let me just copy that. And it just duplicated itself. Oh my goodness. Okay. Technical difficulties, I see. All right. I think everything should be good. All right. So now the last part of this problem, right? We're going to put this in another J option pane. So just like last time, right, we said string input is equal to J option pane dot show input dialog. This time what we'll do is we're going to do another J option pane. Instead of putting an input box, because right, this would just give us like an input box for a user to input something. We don't need to do that. We can just say show message dialog. And what this will let us do is it's going to have us just show a message itself. Okay, so inside of this box, okay, we can say, actually, I believe this needs a null parameter on it. So show message dialog has two fields to it. I forgot what the first field was, but I know the second field is always the message that you want. So I can just say number of digits. I can concatenate it with a plus sign, right? Have two different messages. And I'm going to call my digits variable here. So it's going to display the message, number of digits, and then whatever this variable is equal to. Right? So this is going to show the message in a J option pane. And that marks the end of that question because it's not asking for us to do anything else with it. Okay, cool. So for the person that was asking, there's summing the digits. I believe it was this part over here, right? The digits plus plus. The only reason we're doing that is just because it's a digit counter. It's saying, hey, if I see a digit, add 1 to my digit counter. Because all I'm just finding out is the number of digits. So I loop through my input. Is it a digit? +1 to my counter. If it's not a digit, ignore it, move to my next character. And that's how we loop through our input string and find the number of digits and show that in our J option pane. Yes, exactly. You have one J option pane for the asking of the input, this one right here, and one for the output. So the input is show input dialog. The one for output is show message dialog. You can think input is just literally input, right? It has a little input box, just like the one here. Show message is just saying show a message. So show something here. There's no box for input there. And both of them are technically dialogues because it's just showing dialogue. It's just showing text either way. And both of these come from this library, right? The one thing we imported, the J option pane library. If I did not have this line of code here, I would not be able to access either of them. You can try this on your own if you wanted to. If you don't have this line of code right here, it's going to say that these functions are not defined because this is coming from this library. If you don't include J option pane, it's not going to know where to get this from because it's saying J option pane dot. This is where it's coming from. Can you explain the char C, like the library for it or the one there? Yeah, I can definitely explain the character. The line, oh, absolutely, sure. So I used two different character functions here. Let's go through what each one of those means. We have the char at function and the character is digit function. So these are going to be, oh, thank you for whoever put the solutions there. Now I can check my work. Okay, we'll go through those once we get through this one part, and then I'll check the solution for this. Okay, so char at, right? This is just saying, I'm gonna just ignore this part for now. This is just saying input, right? Take a string, some string, and you're gonna put the char at function on this. And you're gonna take an integer right here. So this is saying take a string, right? Let's just say that we have the string hello, right? And what this will let us say is, tell me the character at index I. So index I is shown by our loop over here. This goes from 0 to the length of our input. So let's say this is hello, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's going to go for a total of 5, since that's the length of the characters it has. So when our I is 0, this is saying, give me the character at position 0. That's an H. And what I had here was, this was only just to make it a little bit easier to see. I set it equal to character C because I'm going to plug that character in, that H, into our second function here. Character is digit. This is from the character wrapper class. That's why there's a character here. That tells me what I'm testing here. It comes from that character library. And I'm going to be testing if my input here, C, which came from the char at function, is a digit or not. So going back to the hello example, I have an H here. I plug in the H as my character C, and I say, is that a digit? Yes or no. This is going to output either a true or a false value. If I were to ask this instead of an if statement to just system out print, I can just say that, okay, if it's a digit, it would output true. If it's not a digit, it would output false. So it's a Boolean statement, and that's why I can use it for an if statement. If this whole thing is true, that means the character is a digit, so we add 1 to our digits. If it's not true, if it's false, then you just don't do what's inside the if statement. So that's the difference between the char at, the character in your string at position I, and the character is digit function, testing if what's in your parentheses is a digit or not. Okay, let's take a look at the solution for this as well. Is import Java X Swing J option pane the same as import Java X Swing? Because that's what we were using at the lab. I believe so. Yes. Yes, actually, yes, that is correct. So you see how Java X. Okay, so I used Java X Swing dot J option pane. That tells me from the Java X Swing library, just import the J option pane library. If I were to do something like Java X dot swing with a star, this is saying import everything from the Java X Swing library. So in this example, the only thing we're using is J option pane. So it doesn't really pay to put in like the star. It would just be a bunch of wasted library functions that get added to our program. But if you're doing a lot of these, remember, you would need to say import Java X Swing J option pane or text file input or really whatever you're importing. So if this makes it a little bit easier. But keep in mind, if there's a function that you don't want to use, maybe you defined your own version of a J option pane, um, that star imports the whole thing. So you have to be very careful because you might have kind of a name collision when you call a function, but it gets called from this library, and that's not what you intended. So that's the difference. You can import things manually, or you can do things with a star. For J option pane, we only need to know the show input dialog and show message dialog, right? I believe so. As long as you haven't done anything else in the labs, I'm pretty sure that you just did show input and show message. But if there were anything else that you did in the lab, then just you should also know those too. But chances are you would just kind of need to know your inputs and outputs. Yeah, honestly, as a side note, the best way to study for this class, go through the projects and labs that you've done and make sure you understand the syntax and the logic behind it. Because a lot of this is quite similar to like things that you've done before, right? The first question, you can have your command line arguments and illegal argument exceptions. That's exception handling. I'm pretty sure you guys have done that in one of your projects already. For the question two, right, you're just making a method. You've made methods before. You've looped through arrays, so it's very similar to that stuff. And even for this one, you guys have done J option panes in the past, so this is just really putting it into practice. And I can see the fourth question is involving class and objects, right? You have getters and setters. Well, that's going to be a fun one. Yeah, exactly. So you've done these before too. Like you've done object-oriented programming, classes and objects. So this is just kind of putting it all into perspective for you. So really, if you can do these problems and you understand your labs and your projects, you're going to be in good shape for the exam. So honestly, I'd say just keep practicing. Like keep practicing those problems. Like try to write them once with your notes as backup, and then try to do it without your notes. When you can write a whole problem without your notes, then you know that you understand it good. That's the best way to study for these kinds of classes. Is the test all short answer? I believe so, yes. It would definitely be in a very similar format to this. You can probably expect also around like maybe 4, 5 questions max. Since these are kind of involved, you have to write out quite a lot. I'm pretty sure there would not be any multiple choice questions. On Lord's final exam, there are multiple choice questions though. So just something to keep in mind. Again, to practice, just practice typing these out yourself. Write them out actually write them out yourself because that's how it would be on the exam. Does null mean no value? Yep, that's correct. It always confused me why specifically we used it in lab. Yeah, that's a great point. So when input is not equal to null, null just means empty, right? There's nothing here. So I'm saying if input is not equal to null, that means input has something inside of it. So null is just a way to say empty, right? If we were dealing with numbers, we would probably have set this to 0. But null is mostly used when it comes to strings because it's just kind of a way to say like an empty that's empty. You can probably also write it like this too, I believe. Null is just usually kind of like a catch-all case. Um, because like in case it's not a string, null is kind of like that universal way of saying, hey, it's nothing, it's empty. Versus this is just an empty string. So like if you have a character, actually, that would be a good way to say null as well. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna actually just take a look at the answer for this as well, just make sure we're all on the same page. Oops. Yeah, so you guys can all see the answers that were put in there. I'm assuming this is also on Brightspace as well. So you can definitely take a look at these as well. So this question is saying string input line is a J option pane, show input dialog. Oh, okay. So I did miss something here. So you know how I said null over here? We also need to have null as the first argument here. I actually kind of forgot why that's the reason. If one of the other tutors here knows why, if they could kind of put that in the chat, but for the function, it takes in 2 parameters. So your second parameter is always the one with your message in it, just to keep in mind. So yeah. Okay, we have our sum is equal to 0. So I just said digits is equal to 0. You can call variables whatever you want. We have our loop that says loops from 0 to our input line dot length. If character is digit, then okay, yeah. So in the answer, the professor wrote this all in one line. So I spread this out as character is digit C. Technically, I could have also done it putting this part input dot char at. I could have replaced that in the parentheses with C. I just split this up into 2 parts just to make it a little easier, but it's the same thing. It's saying some character C is equal to this value, and that value gets plugged in here. So whether I do this in 1 line or 2 lines, it's totally up to you. So that's just to clarify the way that he did it in the answer key. Yeah, and otherwise this looks all good. Digits plus plus, and then you show your message dialog, have null as the first parameter and the second as your message. I think null just centers the dialog on screen. Okay, yeah, that would likely make sense. Yeah, so just keep in mind then, the first parameter is null, the second parameter is your message. You can definitely test this out on your own, by the way. It's good to kind of experiment with this a little bit. Will this be an error if you don't write null? If it's just for, okay, so it does cause an error. All right, yeah. So if that's the case, because remember, this is a function, right? This is saying J option pane dot show input dialog. It's a function that does something. So it's meant to take in 2 parameters. So if you only put 1 parameter in, then you're going to be causing an error because, okay, great example. Think of our first question. If there are not 2 arguments, throw in a legal argument exception. There's an error for not having those 2 arguments because it's not able to function correctly. So even having null as an argument, that counts. You want to make sure you have something there at least. So you can always think of it as the example that we did. If there's not 2 arguments, you have an error immediately. So you always want to make sure that you have the matching arguments that go into your function. Okay, so that one is all good. Okay. Any other questions about this one, by the way? Right, let's go on to the last question here. I think we should have enough time for this one, and then that will probably make the end of the session. If you have any questions about other things as well, there might be a little time at the end. You could ask those questions. We can go over some other things as well. Otherwise, if it's a larger question, you're also welcome to schedule appointments with the Learning Commons. We have plenty of tutors for 212, and for other classes as well. So by all means, if you want one-on-one support, we are more than happy to help you out with that. So in the meantime, let's go to the last question. This one is dealing with classes and objects. So this is question 4 right here. So write a class called book that contains the following information. We have instance variables for the title, string, author, string, and price, float of the book. Right, these are just the data types of each of these variables. Looks like we only have 3 variables. Okay, we have a 3-argument constructor to set each of these instance variables above. Okay, when they say that, a constructor is just what gets us from our main function and constructs an instance of the class. So it's going to set our title, author, and price, which are the variables above. If the title or author is null, or the price is less than 0, throw an illegal argument exception stating that the argument is not correct. Okay, that's just like what we did in question 1. And lastly, get and set methods for each variable. Okay, we'll go over more of that in a minute, but getters and setters, right? Getters are to get a value, setters are to set a value. So whenever you deal with classes, you have to go use getters and setters to get values and set values because it's as if they're the key that opens that class. Okay, awesome. Let's go through this problem now. So we have public class book. I'm going to do this over here so we have a little bit more room. So we have public class book. All right, first things first, we have instance variables for the title, author, and price. These are just ordinary variables that we have, but the way that makes them instance is that they're only instantiated through the class. We're going to make them private. Private makes sure that they're going to only be accessed through getters and setters. You can't access these guys through our main class without those getters and setters. We have our private string title, private string author, and private float price. All right, so now we're going to make our constructor. So what our constructor does is public book. So anytime a book is called from our main function, it's going to go immediately to this constructor. This is like the first thing, and it's going to build us a book. We're going to pass in our parameters. We're going to say our string title, we can call that T. We're going to have a string author, we can say string A, and we're going to have a float price, we can call that float P. Okay, why am I using different variables than the ones that I made? Just to show that these are what's getting passed in from the main function. We have to actually set these guys to be our instance variables to have the book created. So what we'll do now is we'll do just that. We need to first, though, see if these are valid arguments or not. So if these guys are null, that means we have to immediately throw an exception. There's an issue here, there's a problem, we can't go any further. So let's do a test for that, right? If any of these values are null, so I can say if t is null, or if a is null, or if p is null. All right, this is our friend the null value again. And this is just saying if they're empty, right? I'm using this instead of saying 0 for the float, by the way, because 0 is a price, right? That's saying that the book is free, and free also counts as a price. So null is just saying that the person just left it completely blank. So if that's true, if any of these guys are null, this is going to be throw our illegal argument exception. And this is going to just say some sort of message. Okay, it says throw an illegal argument exception stating that the argument that is not correct. Oh, okay. So if it's stating the argument is not correct, the argument that is not correct, then we do have to put these guys separate, because we want to say that, hey, your title is empty, or your author is empty, or your price is empty. So instead of having or values, I'm going to put these guys individually. So if the title is null, I'm just going to say bad title. Now, if, let's say, the author is null, I'm going to say bad author. And lastly, if the price is bad, is null, I'm going to say bad price. None of the strings that I put in here matter, by the way. Like, it's totally fine to have really anything. This is just the message that's going to appear in that red error text, telling the user, hey, you have a bad title. Your title is null. You have a bad author. Author's null. Price is bad. So the reason that I'm doing this separate is it's just saying throw an illegal argument exception stating the argument that is not correct. So it's saying, tell us the argument that is bad here. If I were to put them all together, because actually I see that's the way they have it in the answer, that would just say there is a bad argument. It's not specifying what the bad argument is, because if I'm saying or, if T or A or P is null, it's just saying one of those, at least one of those has to be bad. If it was just saying that, stating that an argument is not correct, not specifying what it was, then yeah, I could totally put it all together. But since I'm putting these guys separate, now I can specify exactly what is bad here. So this is going to, now at this point, if it made it through all of these if statements, that means we have arguments. That means we have values that we can actually input here. And that's what we'll do. We'll set our instance variables equal to the inputs that were given. So just to confirm, because I know this part can get a little confusing, these are the instance variables: title, author, price. TAP are the inputs. We're going to set our inputs equal to the instance variables. So all I'm going to say is title is equal to T. Author is equal to A, and price is equal to P. You're probably thinking like, oh, wait, aren't they just the same values? Well, they are going to be the same values, but remember, we didn't set anything equal to title, author, or price initially. None of these guys were initialized. So now we're going to actually initialize them with the values that came from the user's input when they called the book function. So this is the first part. This is the constructor itself. Before we go on, does this part make sense to you guys?
Yes.
Cool. All right. So now the next part. All right, so we did 2. So we're all done with 1 and 2. Now we just need to make getters and setters. Put these guys in red. So once again, we need getters and setters because these variables are private. We need a way to access them and to set variables to them. It's as if the key that gets you in and out of a house. So I'm going to make a getter and a setter function for this, right? We're going to have public. Getters are going to return a value. So because of that, I'm going to say public string. I'm going to say get title and return title. So this is going to say, okay, I have my get title function. It's going to return a string, and it's going to return title. This is how I can get from this private variable outside of the function. Instance variables are private, yes. So that's why they're called instance. They're an instance of this class. They only exist inside of this class. If we want to get them out of the class, we need a getter. And I'm just going to make a getter for the other variables too. I can do public string get author, right? And author is also a string. And I just need to return the author. And then price. Price is a float. So this time we're going to return a float, get price. Oh my gosh, I can't spell. And that's going to be return price. These are our getters. That's all that there is to making a getter. All we need to do is just make sure that we have the return type and what gets returned. Because getters are getting a value, returning a value. Setters, on the other hand, are going to be a little different. I'll make the setters another color. Let's go for green. Here we go. All right, make a little bit more room. And now for the setters, right? Setters are going to set a value. It takes in a parameter and it leaves it there. So I will not have a return type on any of these guys. So it's going to be public void set title. But this time, remember how I said get title had no parameter? Set title is going to have a parameter. This is going to be the variable that the user is going to put in. And what variables are we using for the user that are coming from outside? That's going to be our string T, string A, and float P. So all I'm going to say is set my title to string T. This is going to be an input that the user is going to give me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to test to see if this is valid, because I did that before, right? For every input, I want to say, hey, if this is not valid, if this is null, throw an illegal argument exception, right? And again, add title, you get the picture. Otherwise, if it's good, guess what? We can assign it to our instance variable title. Okay, and now we're good to use this to set the title. I'm going to do the same thing for the other two, right? So public void set author. This time plugging in string A. If if A is equal to null, we're going to throw another argument, right? Bad author. And then the last one, right, is just going to be public void set price. And this is going to be a float P. And I'm going to say, hey, if P is null, throw an illegal argument exception. Right? And that's what our setter is going to do. So this is going to be our entire code for this, right? We have our constructor over here in blue. We have our getters here in red, and we have our setters here in green. Each of these guys is a function, right? You have a get title, you have a set title. Get author, set author. Set price, get price. So when someone decides to create a book, you can actually do it two different ways here, right? I can say, okay, create the book all at once. Use my constructor. Or I can say, create things individually. Set the titles individually, set the author individually, set the price individually. So let's do a little bit of practice with that in case, maybe he asks like, hey, create an instance, create a sample instance. I can say book, my book is equal to, I'm going to call the new function to create a new book with my parameters in here. I need to put in a string T, string A, float P. So I can just say example title, example author. Actually, these are strings, so they need quotes around them. And example price. Actually, because price is a float, we could just put something on. Let's just say $10.99. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a book, right? It's called my book, and it's of the book class. It's just like saying int number or something like that, or double price. Just declaring it here. This right-hand side is going to actually create it. It's going to use our constructor. We're saying new because this is going to be a new book. We're creating it using a constructor. That's when we use our new keyword. Call the book constructor. We have that defined right here in blue. And we're going to plug in our three parameters. A string for the title, a string for the author, a float or double for the price. And this is going to create our thing for us. Now, once this is created, I can actually switch values by setting them individually. So I can say my book, which is of the book class. So I can use the dot operator to go through what the value would be, and I can use all the functions I created. I could say my book, set title, and my string is going to be new title. I could do this for any of the prices or anything. So any of them could work for that. Now, if I wanted to get the value, right, my book dot get, let's say price, and then I want to do something with this, right? Because there's no it just returns something. I can say price is a float. So I can say float X is equal to my book.get price. So my book is $10.99. So this says, okay, get the price. This becomes $10.99. Float X is equal to $10.99. So this is just a sample of how we could use what we created here to create a book, uh, edit a book, or get the values from a book. And the reason that we're doing this through getters and setters is because our variables are private. Instance variables are private, therefore we need the key that unlocks them. Can you use null for a float variable, or would you have to say p is less than 0.0? Depends on what the problem's asking for. I used null as a default because you know what? Maybe a book could be free. I don't know, maybe $0.00 is a valid price for a book. So I used null as a catch-all to just say, hey, if it's empty, if this field is empty completely, then throw an error. It's just a matter of, do you want to include 0? Then just use null. Or if you don't want to include 0, like you need to make sure that the book has an actual price to it, then you want to make sure that like if you want to like if the book is going to be if the book can be $0.00, then you're just going to say null. But if you don't want the book to be free, then you can use $0.00. So it's just saying, hey, what causes this error? Whatever this value is. If it's null, is it empty? That causes an error? Cool. If it's free, if that causes an error, that can work too. That's what's great about illegal argument exceptions. You can do anything you want, really. Even something that might not cause an error, could, be causing an error in your program. Technically, a book can be free. If you don't want it to be free, make sure you have it reflect that. Would P equals null or P is less than... Yeah, that's actually a good way to say it too. Actually, that's good to count the fact that if you don't want a negative value either. So this would probably be a good way of saying it, right? If P is equal to 0, if P is equal to null, if it's an empty string, or P is less than 0.0. So this would satisfy the fact like, hey, if it's null, if it's an empty string, bad price. If it's a negative number, bad price. It really comes down to the fact what in your program causes an illegal argument exception. You have to choose what that is. So, maybe like a bad title, if a title is like maybe if the title's a number, you don't want that happening. So you can say, hey, if the title is a digit, or is an int, or is a float or something, throw an illegal argument exception. You can be very flexible with that. The question was a little vague. That's why there could be multiple answers to it. Honestly, do what makes the most sense for the problem. So yeah. Any other questions about this one? In the setters, do we need to include author is equal to A after? Oh my goodness, yes, I completely forgot about that. So I never said anything here or here. So see how I said title is equal to T? I want to make sure I have author is equal to A and price is equal to P. So you want to make sure you actually have the setter here. So this is the proper way of doing it. Just like how we did here. We test if it's valid or not. If it is valid, set it. Test, set. test, set. Same here. Test, set, test, set, test, set. We're using the setters to validate the data. Yeah. So remember the example I gave. This all has to be valid. But if I want to switch this to a new title, what if I set this equal to an empty string? That's not good. This is null. This is not good. I need to test to make sure that this is valid before I actually set this. Because what's the point of testing in the beginning if someone can manipulate it at the end? So that's the whole point of why we always validate, well, we always validate data, period, before we actually set a variable. So it's always a good practice to have. All right. Any other questions on this, by the way? Okay. So this is the end of the session, as well as the end of this practice. I hope this was able to help you guys out. The recording will be available probably as soon as it finishes processing. It'll be on the Learning Commons website. And yeah, you guys can always rewatch it. If you guys want further help, you're more than welcome to schedule tutoring sessions with our tutors. We have tutors from like 9 to 5, Monday through Thursday, as well as our tutors from 9 to 2 online on Fridays. So feel free, if you want to go through a question a little bit more in depth, you're more than welcome to. So if you guys could just also, before you leave, fill out the feedback form. The link in the chat. Send to everyone. Yeah. So this is the feedback form, just if you could fill it out. It helps us a lot because we can kind of find out what we can do better, how we can help you out a lot more if you want more of these sessions. If you want to go over a certain thing, just totally let us know, and we're here to help you. So yeah, thank you all for coming. Of course, happy to help.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you.